from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 18, verses 1 through 9.
After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent David on was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on,
Story of David and Jonathan. I don't know if many of you have heard that story, but you may have heard the phrase about the friendship of Jonathan and David. It was a close-knit friendship, which was an unlikely friendship, very hard to find in this world. It happened somewhere in the 11th century before Christ, when David was chosen to be the king after Saul. Saul was the first king that God gave the people of Israel. They didn't have a king before that. And God wanted to be their king. And God told them several times, "I am your king, and follow my word." But they started complaining because the Egyptians have a king and Pharaoh. The other nations around them, Syria and all of them, have different kings and leaders, and we need some leadership. So finally, after their complaints through prophet Samuel, Samuel was the prophet, and God was dealing with them through judges and prophets during that time directly and giving them his guidance through prophets and judges. But the people did not want that. They want political leadership. They want people's leadership. We like democracy a lot because it's the power of the people. But there is a better way to rule, is God's kingdom, where God is the king and not people, because we make a lot of mistakes. That's what we are suffering. But if God is our king, we don't have to worry about evil, because God knows when to intervene, and he will use the right people to do it. But like any other nations, they struggled. They struggled against their leadership at that time and prayed to God for a king. So finally, God gave them a king, which was Saul. And Prophet Samuel went and anointed Saul, but he didn't turn out to be a very good leader. And he was a coward many times, was afraid of the enemies, and he would not stand up for God's covenants and God's words. And that way he was straying away from God's path that they wanted to follow. That's when God wanted Prophet Samuel to go and find a king. And God sent Prophet Samuel to Jesse's house, a guy who was living there, and then asked him to anoint one of his sons. And he went there, and he had several sons. Jesse had several sons, and they were big and tall. And some of them were already in the military. When Samuel went to Jesse's house and told them that I am here to anoint one of your sons as the king, as God told me. But naturally, the father Jesse told that it was going to be one of the older ones who are already in the military. They have the military training, and they are big and tall and well built. So he brought his sons from older and the first one came, and David said, "No, God is not pleased with this one." Then he brought his second one, and God said he is not pleased with that one. So he brought his third one. Then finally, Samuel said, "Is that all you have?" Well, then Jesse said that I have one boy left, but he's a very young boy, and he's out in the fields. So he's tending the sheep. I don't think you want to anoint him as the king. And Samuel said, "No, I am not going to finish my mission here until you bring him here also." Jesse sent for the little boy who was in the fields, and he came. And lo and behold, God told Samuel to anoint him. A shepherd boy whom even his dad and parents did not believe that he was going to make it, who was sent to tend sheep, was anointed as God's chosen one for to lead the nation of Israel after Saul. And Saul was still the king. And after all of this that happened, the Philistines started coming to war with Israel. And you know the story of Goliath. And Goliath was the big giant Philistine who threatened the Israelites, and he was saying curse words to the God of Israel day and night, challenging the Israelites to come forward to fight with him. And as you know, Saul was kind of a coward. He was afraid. And if the leader is afraid, and who is going to fight for a leader who is already afraid? So the military was not that prepared to go and face this Philistine or the Philistine attack. And then David heard about it. And David went to the war field, and his brothers were already fighting there in the field, and they did not like this little boy come up. But he went there and told his brothers, can I tell you something? I think I can fight this guy. They didn't believe him. I mean, nobody would believe him. A little boy. He said, yes, I can fight him. And then the brothers were mad at him for coming into the front, military front, from the leaving the sheep in the desert. So they didn't like it. But eventually he was presented to King Saul. He told him, King, I have in the past, when I was tending sheep, there was a lion that came to attack my sheep. I fought with that lion with my hand and killed that lion. Oh, if that's so. So Saul said, in that case, go ahead, and I will give you the charge to go and fight this Philistine Goliath. And you know the story. David went there, not with bows and arrows or swords or anything like that. He went there with a sling and 5 stones. Remember that story? And he went there and he challenged the Philistine Goliath, used his sling and hit him on the head. And with one shot, he killed the Philistine. And the Philistines were afraid because their leader was gone, and that he won victory. That is when Israel they gathered together and started singing praise for David, the little boy. And what did they sing? Saul has slain thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And Saul also had won victories, but he killed only thousands. And now the Philistines are gone. So the people were singing praises to David, a little boy. Saul did not like to hear that song. He was afraid that David will take over his kingdom. So he started hating David from that point onward, and he wanted to kill him, and David had to run for his life. That is the background of the story. But even in the midst of all of these things, Saul, the king, had a son called Jonathan, who was in the palace. And he and David became close friends because Jonathan knew from the experience that his father was doing. He was not a good leader, and he was looking at David, how much leadership he has, and he can lead battles, and he already killed Goliath. And Jonathan knew that this was going to be God's chosen one. So he became friends with David, and we hear that David, from that day, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow and his belt. What does that mean? King Saul's son Jonathan, the natural follower of the kingdom to become the next king, Saul's son, now taking off his tunic and his sword and his bow and belt and giving it to David, a little boy. He's telling him that, I know I am not going to be the next king. I know God has chosen to be the next king, and he recognized David. And that added to the anger of Saul. Saul became angry at Jonathan, and you know that Saul is already angry with David. There goes from downhill the leadership of King Saul, and eventually King Saul was killed in the Philistines along with his son Jonathan. And we see later on in chapter 23 and 24, David is lamenting for King Saul and his son Jonathan, because they were both killed in the war front by the Philistines. But the friendship of Jonathan and David kept on going through the times when Saul was trying to kill David, and David had to run for life as a young boy from the king. But Jonathan, who was in the palace, was giving word to David what plans King Saul was planning to kill David. So he would go and give the word to David so that he can hide or do whatever he wants to be in a safe place. So Jonathan and David became so much close in their friendship that they became an example of close friendship in this world. The foundation of our friendship is the most important thing that I wanted to bring. What is the foundations of our friendship? Are we driven by our personal gains when we look for somebody to be a friend? There is something called a WWF. What is in it for me? WIFM. What is in it for me? Is that what drives our friendship? When we make friends with someone, or even when we want to friendship with God, what can I receive from God? If I don't receive what I want, then God is not my friend. If I don't receive from my friend what I'm looking for, I don't want to be his friend. Is that the way we look at things? But Jonathan's and David's friendship was different. Jonathan gave ultimately his life. Even at the risk of his life, he loved David and worked for his safety whenever he could. Many of the proverbs and examples in the Bible teach us the importance of friendship. We read that in Proverbs 17, and we also read that in Proverbs 27. And we talked about the friendship or the relationship we had we saw with Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, who did not abandon her even in the midst of their grief. So in Proverbs, we read that a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. In times of adversities, a real friend sticks closer than a brother. That is the kind of friendship that we saw in David and Jonathan. The golden rule about friendship is that whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. That should be the basis of our friendship. These things and common sense verify the importance of being friendly if you really want to have good friendship with somebody. A writer says like this: anyone who establishes a friendship for access to power, money, or other gains, when these ends are not attainable, the friendship ceases. Love that is not dependent on selfish ends is true love of the other person, since there is no intended end. King Saul had been changing for the worse over the years. Once he was a humble, obedient man of faith, Saul became arrogant, disobedient, and then he could not stand the praises that the people were giving to David. And then from then onwards, he became failed leader, that we see that he was killed later on by the enemies. Jonathan likely became the best friend for David because God chose them to be friends and do the right relationship that they had to do. But Jonathan and David had in common together. You know why they had a close friendship? Because they had a common friend together, their friendship with God, who will be there for you regardless of when or what happens in our lives. That's what we say, that we have a friend in Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus. And we are going to sing that song. God's friendship is not based on what he can get out of you. Many of times our friendship is based on what we can get out of God. If God can give me this, then I can be a good child in front of him. But God's friendship to us and relationship to us is not based on anything that he expects from us. He does not expect anything from us because we have nothing to give him. Our sinful life itself, we are not deserving of his love, but he loved us regardless of our condition, our situations. God said, never will I leave you or forsake you. We read that in Hebrews 13:5. Many times we have friendships that come and go, like the fans and love that people have with their teams. When the teams win, They are becoming big fans. And when their teams lose, they don't talk about that much. Some of them abandon and go to the teams that win. That's what the word does. But that is not the friendship that God wants to have with us. He has a friendship that he develops with us. If we are sincere with him, he will not abandon us in the midst of hardship and bad times. Jonathan tried to reconcile Saul and David many times, but that did not happen. But God eventually anointed David, and David became the greatest king of history of Israel. We all have experienced times of loneliness in our lives. In certain seasons of life, we find ourselves not having many friends. As we grow older, especially in our senior years, many of our friends start going away from this world, and we find ourselves having not too many friends. But remember, there is a friend who is closer than a brother, and God is there going to be there with us even in the seasons of our times. Friendship. There is a book called Quality Friendship by a person by name Gary Ingrate, who wrote this book based on the experience of two soldiers in the Afghan war recently. And two of them were fighting side by side, British soldiers, each other in the Afghan war. During an enemy attack, one of the men was critically wounded and was unable to crawl back to safety from the front line. So the friend saw his friend was shot and he was struggling for his life. The other soldier decided to go and rescue him. But the sergeant of that company was very unhappy because his plan was that, he's way beyond rescue. It is very risky to go and rescue a dying person. He's going to die anyway. So the sergeant said, don't go. And he gave orders of the group that nobody is going to go there during this time because of the situation at the front. But this particular friend who was so sincere and united with this guy in friendship so much closer, he said, I am going to break your command. I'm going to go against your command to help my friend. And he went over to the front line, taking a lot of bullets in his body, and dragged his friend back to the camp. By the time he was dead, and this friend was almost dead by the time he came back. And now one more person had to be tended to. And the sergeant was not very happy at all because we have more soldiers injured and he has more problems in his hand. The sergeant told him, you broke my command. You went against my command. What a waste of time and money and energy. He's dead and you are dying now. It just wasn't worth it for our camp. Then this man told him, oh yes, Sergeant, I broke your command. But when I got to him, he was still alive. The only thing he said to me was, I knew you would come, Jim. That is the kind of friendship that God is asking us to do. What could better illustrate the truth of what Jesus Christ said when he said, greater love has no man than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. We read that in chapter 15 of John's Gospel. And he continues to say that, I'm not going to call you disciples anymore. I'm going to call you friends. A friend who is closer than a brother, who will not abandon you in the time of hardships and difficulties. Jesus was accused of being a friend to tax collectors and sinners. And that's why he came here, to be a friend of the sinners, that he can love you and me and take us back to the kingdom of God as his children. And we are going to sing the closing hymn after the communion service, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Many of you have heard the history behind it. Joseph Scriven wrote this song in the early 1800s. After graduating from the Trinity College in London, he was planning to get married to his love that he started dating at this college. But the day before the wedding, his fiancée drowned in a terrible accident. And devastated, Joseph left Ireland and England and moved to Canada, where he became a private tutor. Eventually, he fell in love with another girl and then decided to get married. But just a few weeks before their wedding, she contracted a pneumonia and she died. This shattered the man and shattered his faith. And he decided to abandon his job And then he began to work for many charities to help people who are in grief. Heartbroken, he became depressed, but he started writing songs. And one of the songs he wrote was for his mother who was ill in England. And he wanted to go and visit her, but he could not for many reasons, because he didn't have money. He left his job. He was depressed. But he wrote this song and sent it to her that he could not join her. That is the song that he wrote, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." D.L. Moody, the great missionary who came across the song, was touched by the words, and he took that song and he gave somebody to give music to this song. And that's how it became one of the hymns in our hymnal, whose all our sins and griefs to bear. Can we find a friend so faithful, who will all our sorrows share? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer. He's the one who is the real friend, who will stick closer than a brother. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what grievous pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Have we trials and temptations? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful, who will all our sorrows share? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Are we weak and heavy laden, covered with a load of care? Precious Savior, still our refuge. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Do thy friends despise, forsake thee? Take it to the Lord in prayer. In his arms he'll take and shield thee. Thou wilt find a solace there.